Hello, and welcome back to Let's Get Lit. In today's episode, we're going to be going over Part 2, Chapter 7 of George Orwell's classic, 1984. We're working our way through Part 2, and this story's taking a shift. Let's see what's going to happen, shall we? This chapter starts out with Winston waking up from a dream with full tears in his eyes. Julia rolled over sleepily and asks what's the matter. Winston said that he dreamt, but it fell short. He tells the reader that it was too complex to put into words, and that with the dream itself there was a memory connected to it that had slammed into his mind after waking up. Winston goes on to explain the dream and how the dream all occurs inside of the glass paperweight. But the surface of the glass was the dome of the sky, and inside the dome everything was flooded with clear, soft light, in which one could see into the distance. He also says that in the dream, a gesture of the arm made by his mother was made again 30 years later by the Jewish woman he had seen on the news film, trying to shelter the small boy from bullets before the helicopters blew them into pieces. Winston tells Julia that up until this moment, he believed that he had murdered his mother. Julia asks, "Why did you murder her?" To which Winston says that he didn't murder her, well, not physically anyway. Winston says in the dream he had remembered his last glimpse of his mother, and within a few moments of waking up, the cluster of small events surrounding it had come back to him. It was a memory that he must have deliberately pushed down out of his consciousness. Winston tells the reader of this memory, and that at the time he could have been no older than 12 years old. He starts off by letting the reader know that his father had disappeared sometime earlier. How much earlier, he couldn't quite remember. Winston goes on to talk about the uneasy circumstances of the times of this memory. Periodical panics about air raids and about sheltering in tube stations, the piles of rubble everywhere, the unintelligible proclamations posted at every street corner, the gangs of youths in shirts all of the same color, the enormous queues outside of the bakeries, and the intermittent machine gun fire in the distance. He also tells that, more importantly, there was never enough to eat. How he remembered long afternoons spent with other boys, scrounging around in trash cans, picking up scraps that they would carefully scrape the cinders off of and eat anyway. Winston said that if they were lucky, they were passing trucks that contained cattle feed, and when they went over to the bad patches in the road, sometimes a few fragments of oil cakes that they fed them were spilled out. He then goes on to say that after his father disappeared, his mother did not show any surprise or violent grief, but a sudden change came over her. It was as if she became completely spiritless. Everything she did was done very slowly and with a curious lack of superfluous motion. How she would almost relapse naturally into stillness, and for hours at a time she would sit almost immobile on the bed, nursing his younger sister. He says that every now and then she would take Winston into her arms and press him against her for a long time without saying anything. He also says that he was aware, in spite of his youthfulness and selfishness, that this was something connected, and he had never mentioned that was the thing that was about to happen. Winston goes on to say that he remembers the room that they lived in, how it was a dark, closing smell of a room that seemed half filled with a bed and a white counterpan. There was a gas ring in the fender, and a shelf was kept, and on the landing outside there was a brown earthen sink common to several rooms. Winston goes on to say that he remembers his mother cooking over the gas ring, and that every time it was close to mealtime, there was always an argument. These arguments were mainly consisting of the fact that Winston was very hungry and would always argue with his mother and beg and plead for bigger portions. Winston says he would try every way he could to get more food, from yelling to screaming to begging to sniveling notes of pathos and more. Winston always says that though she tried her hardest to give him larger portions when Winston was little, he would always demand more. His mother would always tell him that his sister was sick and needed food to gain her strength, but Winston didn't care. And if she wasn't careful, he would try to take the saucepan away and steal it. Winston says that he knew he was starving, and the others were too, but he couldn't help it. He felt that he had the right to it, that the hunger in his belly seemed to justify his actions. He also says that between meals, if his mother did not stand guard, he would start pilfering and wrenching through all the food on the shelf. Then the memory comes of the day of his mother's disappearance. It all started when the chocolate ration was issued. Winston says that there had been no such issue for weeks or months. He says that he remembers that there was a 2-ounce slab between the three of them that they were supposed to share, and that it was obvious that it ought to have been divided into 3 equal pieces. Winston then demands that he should be given the whole piece, and his mother told him not to be greedy. Finally, after a long period of deliberation and fighting with his mother breaks the chocolate bar into a 3/4 piece and a 1/4 piece. She gives Winston the 3/4 piece and his sister the quarter. As Winston watched his mother do this, he stood there for a second, and then, as if without thinking, he steals the other piece from his baby sister and runs to the door. His mother calls after him to come back and give his sister back the chocolate. He says he stopped, but he didn't come back, and that his mother's eyes were anxiously fixed upon Winston's face. Winston also mentions that though his sister was still a baby, she realized something was stolen from her and began to cry. His mother drew her arm around the child and pressed her face into her breast. Winston said that something in that gesture told him his sister was dying. So he turns and flees down the stairs with chocolate growing sticky in his hands. He says that he never saw his mother again after that. And after he devoured the chocolate, he felt somewhat ashamed of himself. So he hung around the streets for several hours until hunger drove him back home. When he came back, his mother had disappeared. He says that nothing was gone from the room except his mother and his sister, and they had not taken any clothes, not even his mother's overcoat. He says he's not sure what exactly happened to his mother, or if she was dead. He said it was perfectly possible she had merely been sent into a forced labor camp. And as for his sister, she might have been removed, like Winston himself, to one of the colonies for homeless children, which were called reclamation centers. He says that his sister might also have been sent to a labor camp along with his mother, or simply left somewhere to die. As Winston is telling the story of this memory to Julia, he can tell that she is about to fall asleep again. She says half asleep that she expects Winston was a beastly little swine as a child, and she says that all children are swine. He said, yes, but the real point of the story, but then he stopped speaking because he could tell she was already asleep. At this point, Winston goes into thought with the reader and says that though his mother may not have been the smartest woman, she had something that no one else at the time had, and that was a quiet nobility. It was the fact that in all the actions she did, she had loved and still tried to give love. He gives an example that by saying that with the chocolate memory, even though Winston had stolen his sister's piece, she still holds the baby sister close to her to try and comfort her. Winston says that it was no use and it didn't really change anything. It didn't produce any more chocolate, and it didn't avert the child's death or her own. But it seemed natural for her to do it. And he connects this moment with the refugee woman in the boat who had covered the little boy with her arm. The symbol itself wasn't going to do anything, but the intention behind it spoke volumes. Thinking all of this through, Winston then realizes that the proles had remained in this condition. They were not loyal to a party or a country or an idea. They were loyal to one another. And for the first time in his life, he didn't despise the proles or think of them as merely an inherent force with which one day sprang to life. He says that the proles remained human. They had not become hardened on the inside. They had held on to their primitive emotions, which he himself had to relearn by conscious efforts. He says that the proles are human beings, and he says this out loud. Then he says that we are not human. Julia had woken up and asked, why not? And Winston and her get into this conversation where Winston says the smartest thing to do would be for both of them to walk out of this place and never see each other again. He said they've been lucky, but that luck can't last much longer. He tells her that she's young and she looks normal and she's innocent, and if she stays clear of people like him, she might stay alive for another 50 years. She says no, and that she's not at all bothered, and that what you do, she's going to do, and that she's rather good at staying alive. Winston says they may be lucky to get another 6 months or a year before things end, and that once things end, they will both be utterly alone, and there's nothing the other can do for each other. He says that he confesses they'll shoot her, and if he refuses to confess, they'll shoot her just the same. He says that nothing they do matters from stopping the party from killing both of them. He says the only thing that matters is that they wouldn't betray one another, although even that can't make the slightest difference. With the conversation continuing, Julia states that though the party can make you say anything, they can't make you believe it. They can't get inside of you. To which Winston says that that's true. They can't get inside of you. He says that if you could still feel that staying human and is worthwhile, even if you can't have any results whatsoever, you have beaten them with that. Winston then goes on to think that even with all the telescreens and the monitoring your every thought or word, they had never mastered the secret of finding out what another human being was thinking. He said now perhaps this was less true when you're actually in the ministry and they're torturing you and they're trying every way they can to get a confession out of you. But if the object was not to stay alive but to stay human, what difference did it ultimately make? They could not alter your feelings, and for that matter, you could not alter them yourself, even if you wanted to. He said that even though they could lay every detail out of everything you had said or done, your inner heart remained impregnable. This is where part 2, chapter 7 ends. I hope you enjoyed this episode. Join us in the next one as we go over chapter 8. Have a wonderful rest of your day. Please remember to like, share, and subscribe. And as always, stay lit.